Okay, thank you so much, guys, everybody. It's good to know that we can hold back. Yeah, we can hold back our scientific meetings, and I think it will be 5 or 6 meetings with me. And then I will be the first presentations, and the other ones in 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Yeah. So 7, including me. And what I will present from now, I think I will not present things out of the meetings here. After I give something like general introductions about our scientific meetings, and I just think to share you presentation from a professor in Michigan or in Maryland University, called David J. Winter, one of the editors of the books about psychological assessment of President. Apa judulnya psychological assessment of political leader, dan David J. Winter is one of the editors. And what came out to my mind that I think it is better for us to know more in a deep way about how let's say psychological perspective can be managed to understand not only political figure, political leader, but also a prominent figure, from our society, from religious figure, political figure, and the other prominent figures. What we will use here, not to assess from their, not to assess psychological assessment, with self-report, or with something like a normal or usual psychological testings usually do. For example, like Rorschach or like Warteg and the other psychological assessment. What we are trying to understand here in our scientific meeting, we want to understand how we can understand, let's say, personality figure or characteristics, a prominent figure, analyze it from a distance. Jadi dianalisis dari jarak jauh. And the books, electronic book that you already have, all of you, even though they analyze in particular way to Clintons and to Saddam Hussein, so they use their speech text, their writings, their writings, and they to understand about their characteristic and personality. So in the book, there are something like demigods of the let's say the experts who conduct psychological assessment from distance with a political figure. Here, David J. Winter, that the one I will share to you his presentations. He is the emeritus professor, Professor emeritus. So if you notice about emeritus professor, even if you want to be supervised by him, he's not available anymore because he already emeritus. So politically, udah dicabut gitu. He has been cut politically from the university. And his focus is in personality and social context. Is popularize something like analyzing with motif imagery. Jadi analyzing motif through text. And the other one, Margaret G. Herman. Ini perempuan, tapi nggak secantik Akiko. Udah tua juga sih. Margaret Herman. Herman dia nama Jerman sih. PhD di Northwestern University tahun 65. Gila, lagi zaman PKI. Zaman PKI dia udah dapat PhD gitu.
Kalau itu boleh satu. Boleh satu. Masih ada juga.
Lah ini gue baru dapat.
Selama sekali ya.
I don't know whether he's still active as professor, a full professor or as emeritus, I don't know. But if you are interested to understand her more, you can contact her. There's an email address there. So, centricity as also one of psychologists who popularized about cognitive complexity that we have used this method about 3 years. 3 years now. And the other one, Stephen G. Walker. It is actually he is the political psychology. His background is political study. So he's a also political study, but he try to understand. He also focusing with political psychology. He is one of the founding, I think, the Society of Political Society of Political Psychology. There is a journal, I think journal with high impact, with high impact and really high, Journal of Political Psychology. This is a bridge between political and psychology. If you have a background from politics, but use your area in between something like issue like political behavior, it can be we can be called as political psychology area. Stephen J. Walker, and the other one, Josh Marcus. Josh Marcus ini he concentrate in psychobiographic. As a political scientist, as a background in political, but start to touch political study with psychology, and it is kind of interesting. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of scholars, a lot of scholars now, even though they start from non-psychologist area, like anthropology or politics or sociology, but they something like there is a trend now. They are trying to understand, or they are to use psychological approach, and it is also happened with Harvey Whitehouse. Whitehouse is the anthropologist, a professor in Oxford University, and develop run a lab there, cognitive and anthropology ethics, but he also touch now it begins to touch psychological area, and supervise psychological student, and like siapa si Marta social psychology, antropologi. Lalu yang satu lagi si siapa? Christopher kemana ya sosial psychology. So there is a different expertise ya. they develop. But when we talk about psychobiography, usually they will concentrate about event something like change your mind or change your behavior. They are more interested with the event. Yeah. That this moment, something like the moment that it changed you a lot.
Okay, particular moment.
If you consider with psychobiography, then we analyze their biography from the childhood to teenager and adulthood, and you try to find, for example, like Obama gitu, misalnya Obama itu most people from the beginnings know he's not a smart person. He's not a smart kid, and it is surprising that he could reach something like he could study in Harvard, and also can be a president, the first president from black. And it will be interesting why, kenapa orang yang dari biasa aja, ordinary people can change to be
what event that triggered the
even the trigger
the transformation.
Misalnya kayak Dimas, ini kerjain gua nggak boleh. Ya ada click moment that made you significantly change. Tahu belum? Emang kalau Dimas kayak belum ada.
Belum ada click moment.
Belum ada click moment. So psychobiographic tend to be concentrated with the context and history of your life, of the figure's life, and try to find why. And there is also research about peace activists, relating between Mandela, Gandhi, and yang di Amerika siapa namanya? Pink, relating with the scholars try to understand, is there any path that that's considered similar or universal, or let's say universal, attached in the peace activist figure.
Common traits.
Common traits or let's say common moments. And it turned out that most of the peace activist figure, they idolize their fathers more than his mother. And it's why it is written a lot in their autobiography about their father. When they start about their father, their movement triggered by the inspiration of their father. Dan hampir semuanya, most of them in high school itu liar, itu memang sudah berontak, ingin melawan. And most of them not coming from a low middle class. Most of them coming from mid or high class.
To be an agent of change, we must have that power.
For example, like Mandela, he is the son of the chief of his. You have to be something first. Someone. Okay, itu dan and start from here. I just think that it will be good for you to know David J. Winter more. And when I watch his presentation, is kind of interesting because he mix our approach to using psychology analysis and try to analyze public figures. Oh ya, lupa. Yang terakhir adalah Gerald and Post. Jadi Gerald and Post ini juga one of prominent scholar when we talk about psychological assessments from a distance, but Gerald Post, and he has assessed a lot of jihadists, I mean terrorists, not just jihadists, terrorists from Iraq, IRA, from PKK, PKK in Turkey, and Tamil ETA from in Sri Lanka. He's not a psychologist, he's not a political scientist, he's a psychiatrist ya, maksudnya psychiatrist. And it will be interesting. I think Pak Faisal will introduce him, and then we'll read his book, The Mind of the Terrorist, and it will be interesting if we know more about Gerald Post works ya. Okay?
Okay.
Without further ado, I will show you presentation from David J. Winter. David J. Winter.
Welcome. Thank you for attending the first of our 4 presentations this year in the Psychology Department Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Frank Connor. I am the department head, and I appreciate seeing all of your faces, and I also appreciate the people who are off in some other room, and I can't see your faces, but I know you're there, so I'm waving to you. Feel free to wave back. I want to introduce you to you today our first speaker of our 4 presentations. If you are interested in the others, you can go to the Psychology Department website. The next presentation is on the psychology of anger. That's in December. We have one in February, which is on Jungian psychology. And then when we have one in April, which is on sports psychology, particularly motivation and how it applies to both sports and life. I am very pleased to introduce you today, today's speaker, Dr. David Winter. Dr. Winter is a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. Dr. Winter did his undergraduate work at Harvard, and he did his PhD work at Harvard. Those are all really fine credentials, but I think what's most important is that he actually graduated from Grand Rapids South. He is from Grand Rapids, and he's come home today to share with you around the politics of psychology.
Thank you very much, Frank. It is a great pleasure to come back to Grand Rapids and an honor to be invited to begin this year's series of psychology talks. You see my title, Can Political Psychology Help Us Know What We're Getting When We Vote? And I hope that all of you, if you're 18 at least, will be voting in a couple of weeks. So you may ask, what is political psychology? And the answer is kind of a fuzzy one. It's an interdisciplinary field, obviously a little bit of psychology, a little bit of political science, but some anthropology, some history, some sociology, even a little biology gets mixed into political psychology. Here's a formal diagram. Social and political structures have effects on individuals, so that's one of the things we study. But at the same time, individual psychological processes affect social and political structures. So we study that too. Cognitions, emotions, motives, social identities, group processes, all of psychology, both as an effect of political and social structures and as a cause. Now, another way of defining the field is to talk about some of the questions that we ask. What makes a good leader? What are the psychological causes of war and of peace? How do we learn about politics? What determines how we vote? Why do we vote? How do people develop left or right attitudes and ideologies? When and why does nationalism appeal to people? What causes terrorism? These are just some of the questions that political psychologists try to ask and answer. Now, today's topic, how do we know what we're getting when we vote, raises a fundamental overriding question that runs all through political psychology, which is, how do you measure the personalities or the psychological characteristics of leaders? You have to do it at a distance. They're not available for all of the traditional instruments of psychological research. I cannot walk into the White House and ask the president to fill out a survey or give him a Rorschach test or ask him to relate a dream that I can interpret. And a lot of the really interesting people are dead and not accessible to psychological research. So what I want to talk about today is some of the ways that we can describe and profile the personalities of leaders, living and dead, at a distance, because we have to do it at a distance. Now, one way would be to say, go by their past performance. Assume the future will resemble the past. The problem is, for, let us say, a president of the United States, there really is nothing like the presidency. It's not a situation they have ever encountered before. It's not like being governor. It's not like being a senator. And it's certainly not like being the head of Bain Capital or the Salt Lake City Olympics. It's a fundamentally different situation. And so, every now and then, when we try to predict from the past, we really go quite wrong. For example, Chester Arthur, President of the United States in the 1880s, was really a political hack, a Republican political hack, working, I believe, in the New York City Customs House when he was put on the Republican ticket as James Garfield's vice presidential candidate in the 1880 election. Garfield was assassinated, Arthur assumed the presidency, and actually he was a pretty good president, relatively honest. And another surprising president was Harry Truman, who rose to power through rose to the Senate through the very corrupt Kansas City political machine, although he himself was very honest. Became president of the United States after Roosevelt died, a few months into Roosevelt's fourth term, and with very little experience, often called the little man in the White House, guided the United States through the changes and the perils of the early post-war years. Harry Truman, a surprisingly good president. So predicting from the past doesn't always work. If you were to try to predict Richard Nixon from Richard Nixon's past, you would have a problem, which is, which Nixon would you pick? In college, he described himself as very liberal, almost populist. Then, as a member of Congress in the late 1940s, he made his initial political name by hunting down communists as part of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Then when he became president, he capped his political career by toasting Mao Zedong in Beijing's Great Hall of the People. So which Nixon predicted which Nixon? And of course, finally, he resigned in disgrace after the Watergate scandals. The past doesn't always work when you're trying to predict what a president is going to be like. Well, another approach is to rely on intuition, and many political leaders believe they have great intuitive ability to understand other political leaders. For example, President Bush, speaking of his first meeting with the Soviet Prime Minister, sorry, that's my generation talking, the Russian Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, said, I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. Well, I think that Bush's subsequent experiences with Putin may have tempered that sense that he understood the man. I think in the end, there he is looking Putin in the eye. Now, what about Barack Obama? He's a mystery to many people. There is a hardcore small group of people who still, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, believe he's Muslim. And even some supporters aren't so sure. Here's a 30-something liberal Democrat who said of Obama in 2008, civil and thoughtful and optimistic, actually awake at the wheel. But 3 years later, an awful negotiator who gives away the farm before they ask for it, a chump. Who is Barack Obama? What is he really like? Well, I tried Googling Barack Obama is, and he's among the best presidents. He's the worst president of all time. He's the first nerd president. He's no James Madison. He's Lyndon Johnson on steroids. Is Sarah Palin the next Barack Obama? That was a dated reference a few years ago. And is Christine O'Donnell the next Sarah Palin? Is Barack Obama the Messiah? These are all from Google. Is Obama and the Antichrist? Barack Obama is your new iPad? Barack Obama is your new bicycle? Very creative answers, but not perhaps very helpful. A few years ago, a year or so into Obama's presidency, I was involved in surveying some people from a large Midwestern city with a diverse economy, which will remain unidentified. These people were largely white, mostly married, fairly conservative, in their late 60s and early 70s. The group that demographically is probably the most anti-Obama in the country. And the answers were all over the place. There was general agreement that Obama was bright, articulate, glamorous, and calm. But beyond that, people seem to endorse a wide variety of different open-ended impressions. Now, to some extent, these varied by their political orientation, but still the range, the divergence is pretty surprising. Disagreement if you were a blue state type, intelligence and character, but more conservative people said he's a political chameleon. Trustworthy, dishonest. Ability to lead, leadership is weak. Trying to improve our country, cares nothing for the country. In tune with common man, doesn't consider how others feel. Mature decisions, indecisive. Second only to Lincoln, unqualified to be president. Open, not listening. Likable, well-intentioned guy. Arrogant, and a narcissist. Well, I'd like to try to unravel a little bit of this today, partly by way of illustrating how one can talk about personality at a distance without direct access, which is one of my main interests in the interdisciplinary field of political psychology. Now, for convenience, I like to think of personality as being divided into 4 parts, or at least this is a convenient working conception. by which I mean that there are at least 4 fundamentally different kinds of elements of personality. Temperament and traits, cognitions, motives, and social contexts. Now, you may be surprised to hear me put social context as part of personality rather than as the field on which personality operates. But I think social contexts are both. Obviously, my contexts, your contexts are the field where we live our lives. But if you think about all of the contexts of our lives, we come to embody them. They live on in us. So, for example, I am a white male of a certain age, raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, went to South High School, was a member of Central Reformed Church, Dutch background, of course, went to colleges, have been at the University of Michigan for 25 years, and so on and so forth. And I have a family, both my parents and grandparents and my children, my wife. All of these contexts continue to live on in me. They have made me what I am. They are a part of my personality. They're also the field on which my personality plays itself out. And so I think we need to consider social contexts as part of personality, and I'm going to begin there with Barack Obama. Now, each of these 4 elements has its own source of data. So, for example, social context, we can get that information from standard social science and biographical sources. If we are to talk about the social context of Barack Obama, first, culture. I'm going to work down from the macro to the micro, sort of. Culture and ethnicity. And for Obama, that's actually rather complicated. He has many and varied cultural and ethnic contexts. Obviously, Hawaii, where he was born and where he spent a lot of his early years. But Indonesia, where he spent several years. He is African American. And he's also African. That is to say, his father was African. But he is of mixed race. And he spent a lot of time working in the south side of Chicago, and so on and so forth. These are all different cultural, ethnic contexts, and they're all a part of Barack Obama, and they all live on, so to speak, in him. Then there's social structure, which is the polite way of saying, do you come from a privileged group or do you come from an oppressed group? And I think that in the United States, even today, it's pretty clear that race is a dimension of stratification, that people of color tend to have come from a less advantaged background. Or, in the words of Obama's inaugural address, the background of people who have endured the lash of the whip and plowed the hard earth. And history is a part of our social contexts. Both our personal history, but our country's and our culture's history. The things that happened before we were born live on through the transmitted memories of our ancestors. Gender. Barack Obama is male. And that, of course, interacts with culture. He's an African American male, and that in turn has certain very specific meanings and opportunities and perhaps limitations in American culture at this point in time. So history and culture and gender all interacting. Age. Barack Obama is, I think, 51. What does that mean in the United States? Is that old or young or in between? But it means something. And then generation, which is the interaction of history and age. So Barack Obama came of age, that is to say, was your age or a little older, late teens, early 20s, when you go out into the world on your own for the first time rather than receiving it through your parents or your teachers. In the 1980s, what was that like? Well, here are some symbols of the 1980s. This was what was happening when he came of age. This is the era that became the norm or the default or the initial setting of his worldview, just like the 2012, what do you call it, the 21st century, second decade, is becoming your notion of what is normal, your default settings. Family. And for Barack Obama, it's especially complicated and diverse. Here's a chart that the New York Times did of the first family. And the absent father, the father that he didn't really know, the father that he had dreams of, and the wife and daughters. And then specific institutions. Punahou School in Hawaii, Occidental College in California, Columbia University in New York City, Harvard Law School, and the Chicago political machine. These are all institutions which Obama participated in and which have left their deposits, their precipitates in him, just as every institution that you have lived in leaves something in you. Yes, this is former Governor Blagojevich, now a convicted felon, and this is Mayor Daley. Okay, so much for the array of social contexts of Barack Obama, and all of this information is pretty easy to get. A lot of this lives on in him. Now let's turn to temperament and traits. This is the public visible part of personality. This is the kind of answer that we get when we say, well, tell me about somebody that I don't know, and what kind of a person are they? And we usually rattle off a few trait names. The Boy Scout law, for example, trustworthy, loyal, courteous, kind, et cetera, et cetera. Those adjectives talk about the general style of the person, the first impressions. And people who know the leader well tend to be able to give you pretty good answers about their temperament or traits. One of the most common traits ascribed to Obama is his calmness, his legendary calmness. And here he is just before being inaugurated President of the United States with a kind of a, I don't know, a Zen look on his face. I wish I could be that calm before some of the things in my life. On the other hand, and Obama can be, I think, contrasted in his calmness to the, let's say, the macho John F. Kennedy, or the compulsively decisive Harry Truman, who never lost any sleep about bombing Hiroshima with nuclear weapons, or the many neuroses of Richard Nixon, or Lyndon Johnson's envy of the Kennedys and his deep sensitivity about his poor background in Texas, which Obama does not seem to have that same kind of sensitivity about his own background, much of which was in poverty as well, or even the calmness of Obama's rather remarkably incurious and unreflective predecessor as President of the United States. So Obama is calm. That seems obvious. There is perhaps a downside to Obama's calmness, and this is from Gary Trudeau, Doonesbury. Sir, you need to work on this damaging perception that you're a bloodless technocrat. Take the economy. It doesn't seem to be getting much better. People are still suffering. Now, forget for a moment what you think about it. How does it make you feel? And then the president responds, it makes me feel like thinking. Sigh. We're in trouble. And that perhaps is the downside of seeming too calm, and maybe this is sort of what the first of the debates, how it played out, though this cartoon comes from a couple of years ago. Okay, now psychologists tend to agree that there are 5 overriding traits, or if you will, super traits, or factors, if you will, from factor analysis of traits. The so-called big 5, extroversion or surgency, agreeableness, conscientiousness, stability, or its opposite, neurotic, and being open to experience. Let's go down the list. Obama is stable or unflappable, or at least it seems that way, although his difficulties with trying to give up smoking might make us wonder whether he's really quite as calm as all that. He seems to be a leader. Yeah, I mean, he's become president. He was fairly forceful, and yet perhaps not so forceful as many of his followers wish he had been. Not at all clear, is he agreeable, or is he really kind of a remote, cold-blooded elitist? Disagreement there. General agreement, I think, that he's conscientious, gets things done, does the dirty work. And widespread agreement that he is curious, he learns from experience, he's open to experience. So, uncertainty about some of his traits, but agreement about some of the others. The open to experience is the sort of thing that higher education tends to give you. You are right here and now in the process of becoming more open to experience, by and large, than you were when you graduated from high school, because of higher education. We try to teach you to respond to threat, not by running away, but by approaching and trying to understand it. Instead of fight, flight, or fright, that sympathetic nervous system complex, we try to say to you, understand it. Do not be afraid of what you do not know. Okay, let's move on to cognitions. How do we judge, and by that I mean beliefs. What's the world like? Or values. What should the world be like? How should I act? Who am I? Cognitive furniture, if you will, of our personality. And we tend to be able to measure that from the explicit analysis of text. That's a fancy way of saying we listen to what people say. Because people reveal their beliefs, and they'll tell you their beliefs if you ask, usually. And from that, we can estimate their cognitive structures and their specific beliefs. So one important structural variable is how complicated is their thinking. Are they simplistic or are they complex? I think there's fairly good agreement, excuse me, with respect to Obama, that he's a complicated person, that he is capable of complex abstract thinking. What is your operational code, or if you will, the operating principles? Now, that's a kind of political psychology jargon term. What it means is two things. What is the nature of human society? Is the world basically a jungle, or is it basically a cooperative place where occasionally people get off on the wrong foot and fight? And then, what's the best course of action? Should we rely on rewards or punishment? Should we rely on words or deeds? How do we act? What's our code for operating in the world? And some political psychologists have summarized Barack Obama's operational code as: times are tough, things are hard, the American dream is in jeopardy, but if we all work together, we can make it better. So there's the notion of difficulty, inclusiveness, improvement. What about authoritarianism? That's a personality variable that includes a kind of emphasis on strong conventional moral consensus and being aggressive or punitive toward people who are perceived as different. You may have heard of the so-called authoritarian personality, or as it's now sometimes phrased, right-wing authoritarianism. Obama seems low, maybe even quite low in that. He seems to have a sense of inclusiveness, a sense of not being hostile toward people who are different. For example, in his inaugural address, he even referred to non-believers as well as people of faith. Explanatory style. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And actually, one of the ways we measure optimism is by how people explain their failures. If you think of your failures as due to something inside you that is permanent and never going to change, well, that's a recipe for pessimism. But if you explain your failures either by saying, well, there was an external cause, the test was too hard, the assignment was unfair, or a temporary cause. Well, I was not in a good mood that day, or I was hungover, or I was too busy to study, but tomorrow might be different. Well, then you are likely to be more optimistic and persist longer, and so forth. I'm not sure about Obama. With respect to the 2010 congressional election, it seemed like he was willing to accept certain responsibility for that. He referred to having been shellacked. But I suspect that he believed that it could be turned around, and perhaps the same explanation for the first debate. So we'll leave that up in the air. And then self-concept. Narcissism, grandiosity, sometimes alternating with abasement. I am either everything or I am nothing. Politics, perhaps as some kind of compensation for some early wound or injury, versus its opposite. I think Obama's relatively low in that. Wisdom or sense of humor. And I would rate him high on that. Okay. Finally, we come to the fourth element of personality, motives, and this is an area of particular research interest for me, so I'm going to talk about it for a while at some length. Motives involve goals rather than style. If traits are the adjectives or the adverbs of personality, motives are the goals. Where are you going? Traits, how are you going to get there? So, for example, traits may involve a consistent action in response to a particular situation. Motives involve goals, and a given motive might lead to a variety of different actions depending on the situation. So imagine that you were quite hungry, and then think about how differently you would act if you were at home at night standing in front of your open refrigerator door with nobody else looking. Or if you were being taken to dinner as part of a job interview. Or if you were in a foreign country where you didn't speak the language and there were no English menus, what would you do? I actually had that experience many years ago in China. I was lecturing in Beijing, and I missed the faculty dining room hours for dinner, and I was very hungry, and in those days there were not a lot of restaurants with English menus or English-speaking wait staff. And so I did something I have never done before or since in a restaurant. I walked into a restaurant, beckoned to a waiter, walked around with the waiter, and every time I saw something that looked good, I pointed to it. The restaurant erupted in laughter, but I got a very good dinner that night. I was adapting my specific actions to the situation in the service of the motives. So actions are not always a very good guide to motives. Partly, a motive can lead to a variety of different actions, but also different motives may lead to the same action. So perhaps all of you are striving to do well here, but for some of you, it may be an intrinsic desire for achievement. For others, you may want to please your parents, etc., etc. So how do we measure motives? Moreover, if we ask people, they're going to tell us what they think their motives are or what they think we want to hear. And so what we're going to get if we ask is their beliefs about their motives or their public press releases about their motives. Motives may be repressed or unconscious, as Freud argued, but they may also be just things we don't think about very often. We kind of live our life and we don't realize the actual goals that we're pursuing. We may think we're studying hard, whereas in fact we spend a lot more time on Facebook, for example. So we often measure motives, or we think of them rather, as implicit. That is, they're not explicit, they're not the sort of things people can tell you about, but we look at the themes that emerge in their speaking or their writing. And so, for example, the thematic apperception test, where you see a picture and you write or tell a story about it, and then another picture, and so on and so forth, is a way of measuring implicit motives. And the same measures, the same scoring systems can be applied to any imaginative text, a novel, a short story, a political speech, an inaugural address, government communications, a company annual report, and so forth. So what motives are there? Well, a lot of research has focused on three. Achievement motivation, that is a concern with excellence, with success in competition, with innovation, doing well, doing better than, doing something unprecedented, being the first in the world to do something. Affiliation, a concern with warm, friendly relations, emphasis on unity, we're all in this together, we are all one. Power, a concern with having impact or affecting other people, their emotions or their actions, or a concern with reputation and prestige, which is kind of like is to power what money in the bank is to spending. It's a way of banking power, prestige. Now, I said these are three motives, and I'd rather think of them not as three separate entities, but as three dimensions of motivational space. We often think of power in a vertical sense, being on top, achievement as forward, backward, and affiliation as near, far. So there really is an indefinitely large number of motives. You can imagine coming from the origin, a fusion of power going up, but also affiliation going out towards you. And so imagine a diagonal from the origin here going up and out. That would be a combination of power and affiliation. Parental nurturance would be an example. Clearly, if you are responsible for raising someone, if you want to nurture them, to take care of them, you really do have to be concerned about having an effect on their behavior and emotions. Parenthood is not a hands-off task. At the same time, one hopes, parents love their children. And so their power is tempered by affiliation and ultimately by a desire that the kids grow up and act on their own and take wing. And so the power a parent has over a child is very often, we hope, self-limiting and kind of terminates. One can imagine combining power with the opposite of affiliation or rejection, and then you have aggression. I want to control, I want to harm, I want to have impact on people that I don't like, on enemies. And so hostility and rejection. So there's an indefinitely large number of motives that represent different combinations or different fusions, or if you will, different vectors of these three dimensions, if that's a helpful way to think of it rather than three separate motives. I hope it's helpful. Yeah, okay, let's move on here. Here's a brief summary of about 3 or 4 decades of research on these three motives. Achievement expressed in verbal images involving excellence or success in competition, not answers to questions. Not, are you striving to be excellent? Because you'll probably tell me, of course I am. But rather, do these images occur spontaneously and naturally in your open-ended thinking and also writing down of your thoughts? People whose verbal images are high in excellence references tend to take moderate risks, tend to use feedback, that is to say they modify their performance on the basis of results. Sometimes cheating if necessary. You could think of cheating as simply a way of, if this way doesn't work, I'll try that way. They tend to be successful in business, particularly as entrepreneurs. And you can see why, because they take moderate risks, not extreme risks, not sure things. They tend to be rational and cooperative in negotiation, and they tend to seek help from technical experts. So that's the achievement motive. Affiliation-motivated people tend to be not always friendly, not always nice and cooperative. When they feel safe, yes, they're very friendly. But when they are threatened, when they think, well, I'm surrounded by people who are different from me or who may not agree with me or who may dislike me, then affiliation-motivated people can get very prickly and defensive, even hostile. So the atmospherics of their immediate situation are much more influential for people high in affiliation motivation. So they may be defensive if you threaten them. And they seek help from friends. And then power-motivated people, people whose verbal images involve control or impact or influence, tend to be good leaders, capable of generating high morale on the part of their subordinates if their sense of responsibility is high. But if it's low, they tend toward a complex that I call aggressive impulsivity. Drinking, multiple drug use, sexual exploitation, verbal aggression, physical aggression, etc. So for power, it may depend on whether that power is tamed or untamed. They tend to be very exploitative negotiators. They know just when to demand their contract be renegotiated. And they tend to seek help from political experts. Okay. Now, the difference between achievement and power, which Americans very often confuse, I think Ralph Waldo Emerson had it right when he said, build a better mousetrap, that's a clear achievement image, and the world will beat a path to your door. That's a clear power image. A person high only in achievement wants to build that better mousetrap and doesn't really care whether the world ever beats a path to his or her door. The power-motivated person wants the world to come to their door, but not necessarily wanting to build the better mousetrap. You can rent somebody else's mousetrap or steal it. Or you can take a mousetrap that really isn't very good and advertise it as the better mousetrap. Anything to get the world to beat a path to your door. Okay, now, I said we score motives by looking at the images, and there are very carefully defined scoring systems that I don't have time to go into. Here's an example of scoring a passage from Barack Obama's 2009 inaugural address. Helps is an image that is both power and affiliation because it's having an effect on other people, and in this context, helps families find jobs, etc. It's a concern for them. It's, if you will, good help or beneficial help. Move forward is an achievement image. Holding somebody to account is a power image. Spending wisely, presumably spending wisely is better than spending foolishly. Reforming bad habits is another achievement image, but we can only count one per sentence. Restore vital trust, having an effect. If you're restoring somebody's trust, you're having an effect on some mental process of theirs. And trust itself is kind of a fusion of power and affiliation. So there's an affiliation image between the people and their government. So this is an example of how you can measure motives at a distance from verbal or written texts of leaders whom you cannot assess directly, and indeed even historical leaders. I could talk about Abraham Lincoln's motives as expressed in his first inaugural address, for example. All right. What do we have from Barack Obama's first inaugural address? 17 achievement images, 16 affiliation, 33 power. Those are raw scores. Obviously, the length of the speech is going to affect those totals, and so we first express them as images per 1,000 words, and we have 7.10, 6.68, and 13.78. And you may ask, well, does that mean he's very high in power because that's his highest score, or is affiliation really his lowest score? Maybe all inaugural addresses of any president will be high in power because that's sort of a power situation. And so what we would like to do is to compare Obama's inaugural address to what? Well, perhaps to other inaugural addresses of other US presidents. And maybe because if you go back to George Washington and Lincoln and Chester Arthur, well, he never gave an inaugural, but you know what I mean. Maybe life was so different and words were so different and pals talked differently in those days. So let's just say other 20th and 21st century American presidents. How are we going to compare? You've all had statistics. You're taking statistics. You should take statistics. We can standardize. That is to say, we can convert those scores into standard scores. Here's a distribution. We assume the motive scores are normally distributed with a mean or average and with a standard deviation. And one standard deviation each side of the mean includes roughly 68% of the cases if it's normally distributed. So the standard score is the raw score minus the mean divided by the standard deviation of the group. This is a standard score of 2.0, a standard score of minus 1.5. So now we can express Obama's scores not as just raw images per 1,000 words, but in relation to other 20th and 21st century American presidents. I don't like decimals and I don't like minus signs, so I convert this to a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100, which is roughly what the SAT and GRE exams scores are scaled as. And so that 2 standard deviations above the mean score changes from 2.0 to 700, and that minus 1.5 changes to 350. Okay, everybody clear on standardization? When we do that, we find that Obama has an extremely high power motive score, 707. Think of that as like a 707 score on the SAT. He is just about exactly average on on achievement, and a little above average, half a standard deviation on affiliation, compared to other 20th and 21st century American presidents. Standardized scores are only meaningful in terms of the particular standardization group that you're using. Here are the scores of the last 4 American presidents: Bush the father, Clinton, Bush the son, and Obama. Notice how there's a kind of a steady upward progression of power. Affiliation seems to seesaw. as does achievement. Notice how Bush the son, like the father, is high in affiliation, but also very high in power and lower in achievement than the father, although the father was just about average. And Clinton was very high in achievement. Okay. Now, here's the result of a decade or so of research on the characteristics of presidential motives taken from first inaugural addresses in relation to a variety of presidential outcomes. Very quickly, power motivation is associated with historians' ratings of greatness or of making great decisions. There's a kind of cottage industry among historians of the presidency about rating presidents, and there are all sorts of multidimensional and factor analytic-based ratings. Taking just overall greatness, it's related to power. Why? Well, notice that power is also related to being involved in a war. And maybe that tells us something about presidential leadership. You have to be a war president to be a great president. Or maybe it tells you something about historians' bias, what it is historians think of as greatness. Or maybe about American history and what Americans like. Notice that achievement motivation, which is related to success in business, is not at all related to success in the American presidency. And why is that? Well, they come into office high in idealism as rated by historians, low, not significantly, but slightly negatively, in flexibility. So they become perhaps frustrated. And so while they're very active, to use some categorizations of the political scientist David Barber from Duke, they're active negative. That is to say, they keep trying to do a lot, but they really end up frustrated and they sort of kind of hate the job. Whereas power-motivated presidents are active positive. They're very active, and you have the sense that they really do enjoy their work. Now, what's interesting is that none of the three motives by themselves predicts getting elected, percent of the votes. But what does predict that is the congruence between the president's motives and the motives of American society at the time of election. In other words, the president who fits the national motive mood, if you will, tends to be elected. Now, how do you measure the national motive mood? One can analyze texts. It's been done with things like popular plays and novels from that era throughout 200 years of American history. Or in a more micro sense, you can take things like Jay Leno's monologue at the beginning of the Tonight Show as a kind of moment-by-moment measure of national mood, and it works either way. Help. What have I done? Couple more findings. Presidents high in power motivation tend to have attempts made on their lives. I'm a little reluctant to make specific predictions about presidents being assassinated or assassination attempts, but I do notice that Obama was very high in power, that the number of threats that the Secret Service has reported on the president's life has increased since his inaugural. Affiliation, people who listen to their friends tend to be involved in scandals, and if you're high in power and affiliation, you tend to be involved in a sex scandal. So here are some predictions, or if you will, postdictions about Obama based only on his motive scores. And some of these may turn out to be colossally wrong. Predictions aren't always right, but some of them I think are pretty good. He will be charismatic to large numbers of Americans, but strongly disliked by others. In other words, power motivation is associated with eliciting intense emotions from other people and from followers, either positive or negative. Polarization, if you will, emotional polarization. Love them or hate them. And I think that may well be true. But we'll see in the long run of history. Obama will be successful in the scrimmage of politics and highly rated by historians. We'll see. He'll enjoy being president and not be frustrated by the gridlock and the problems of politics. Well, of course, every president is inevitably frustrated, but not to a debilitating extent. The U.S. may be involved in a war during the Obama presidency. Well, Libya probably already would count as a war, but there are a lot of other possibilities for wars that might happen in the next few months or the next 4 years, depending on the outcome 2 weeks from this past Tuesday. Okay. Now, I took the scores of Obama, and one of the games you can play, if you think back to that, I have until 2:30, right? Yeah. Okay, and we'll have time for questions too, yeah. One of the games you can play with the three-dimensional space is to locate people as a point in that space, with affiliation as the near-far score, achievement as the forward-backward score, and power as the up-down score. So each president is a point in a three-dimensional motivational space. And you can, well, you can compare people by calculating the distance between those 2 points, the points that represent their motivational locations. I'm only going to do 2 dimensions, power and achievement here, and I'm going to compare Obama to Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin's motive scores were based on speeches, and they were standardized on a group of world leaders, not American presidents. And so, of course, the standardization groups are different, and that may mean that the scores aren't exactly comparable. So they're more like vague smudges rather than carefully defined points. When we do that, and this is the first major use I ever made of the Pythagorean theorem from 10th grade geometry, the distance is the sum of the squared distances on each dimension added, and then the square root. So you take the distance in power, the distance in achievement, and then you get the hypotenuse, the distance between the 2 points. Now generalize that to 3 dimensions. And you see that those 2 guys are looking in somewhat different directions. Putin more achievement motivated, Obama more power motivated. If you play this game with American presidents, you can say, well, which president does Obama most closely resemble? And the answers are 2, Truman and Kennedy. Both, interestingly enough, presidents who came to power through local political machines, but who themselves seemed to have a relatively clean reputation. That is, they were not tarred by the reputation of the machines through which they came to power. Okay, now I want to look at Obama over time. And so I take his announcement of candidacy speech back in '07, when he first announced he was going to run for president, standardized on all the other Democratic and Republican candidates who announced that year. But I'm not going to use standard scores because I'm just comparing Obama to himself, so we're going to use raw scores instead. 12, roughly, power images per 1,000 words, and AF and ATCH. Then his nomination acceptance speech at Denver in August of 2008, his inaugural, and his first 2 States of the Union messages. Now, so what? Power is always the highest. Affiliation goes down slightly, and achievement shows a dramatic increase from 2010 to 2011. What happened? Well, the 2011 State of the Union message was delivered a couple of months after the shellacking in the 2010 congressional election. And so this would be a matter of some concern if you are an Obama partisan. Why would it be a matter of some concern? Well, because as I said earlier, achievement motivation doesn't really lead to very good outcomes in politics. Achievement motivation leads to frustration. Obama came off from the midterm election by saying, well, I'm going to try harder, let's work together. But of course, the Republican Congress was dedicated, in the words of the minority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, his major goal was to ensure that Obama was a one-term president. Well, against that wall, you can keep banging your head, but you're not going to get anywhere. And so, notice, here's a measure of presidential charisma, or appeal, if you will. Notice it's related to power. It's negatively related to achievement motivation. Why? Well, here's Ross Perot, a very successful businessman and entrepreneur, scored high in achievement motivation, ran for president 20 years ago. Time magazine said, how will you govern if you're elected? And he said, well, we take these ideas to the people say, let's do it, and now we have a system out of gridlock and a system that works. That's the process I'll use. And that is maybe the way you run a company over which you have pretty complete control, but it's a terrible recipe for politics, because politics doesn't work that way. Take, for example, Jimmy Carter's campaign autobiography of 1976, Why Not the Best? 4 words, clear achievement image. I can think of several answers to why not the best. First of all, you need to be consistent with your prior accumulated promises. You have to say today what you said yesterday, otherwise you are a flip-flopper. Whereas achievement-motivated people tend to vary what they say, tend to vary their actions depending on what works. Well, that is not necessarily a good way to act in politics. Your fans will have their sense of belief and trust in you eroded because we don't know what this guy stands for anymore. And your opponents, as I said, will jump on you and call you a flip-flopper. Different constituencies have a different notion of what's best. If you're head of a company, you can get rid of anybody that disagrees. But if I'm Justin Amash, 3rd District in Michigan representative, I may believe, I probably should believe if I want to get elected again, that if it doesn't benefit the 3rd District of Michigan, it ain't the best. And so there's nothing a president can do against someone, a constituency with an independent base who has a different idea about what's best. Besides, some people in politics may not give a hoot about the best. They may enjoy opposition, criticism, and attack. Mitch McConnell said, I want to make this guy a one-term president, with perhaps the notion of, and I don't care what else may happen as a result. So you're going to have to compromise, and that may mean you'll have to sell out the one best answer. The best will almost certainly cost too much. Then there's sheer bureaucratic inertia, and the best is going to have to be implemented by the civil service, people you did not appoint, may not trust, and can't get rid of. So for all these reasons, I suggest, achievement-motivated presidents, people who go around saying, why not the best, are going to die a little bit every day. And they're going to be unhappy. As opposed to power-motivated presidents who have the capacity to enjoy the scrimmage of politics. Sure, they want to get done their goal, but they also enjoy getting down and dirty in the trenches of politics. So to illustrate my point, I have selected 2 very biased, deliberately biased sets of pictures of presidents higher in power than achievement and presidents higher in achievement than power using the standardized scores, and see if you can determine the difference. Okay. Achievement-motivated presidents tend to end up frustrated. They may cut corners like Nixon. They may exhaust themselves and ruin their health like Woodrow Wilson. They may try to micromanage like Jimmy Carter. And in 1979, when everything seemed to be going wrong at once, the economy, the hostages in Iran, he went into seclusion at Camp David, called in experts, then came down from the mountain and delivered a so-called national malaise speech, although he didn't use the word malaise. He said, well, the government is incapable of action, special interest, paralysis, stagnation, a certain route to failure. He then set a clear goal for a national energy policy, 3 specific proposals, none of which was even taken up or enacted by Congress. That's the frustration of high achievement motivation in politics. It's great for running a company, but it really doesn't get you very far in politics. And so the question is, what was Obama going to be like in his 2012 State of the Union message? So, achievement back down. Still higher than before, but at least it didn't keep climbing. And so one could predict a couple of things. Number one, there will not be a sense of malaise. And number two, that he will come out fighting in the 2012 election campaign, a little bit like Harry Truman's famous whistle-stop tour of 1948. That'll explain the second and third debates. I have no explanation for the first debate. Well, I have an explanation, but it would get you into what my personal politics are, and you don't want to hear that. Well, maybe you want to hear it, but I shouldn't talk about it. So, now you may, oh, well, yeah. If you want to compute a vulnerability to frustration index, which is the ratio of achievement per 1,000 words to power per 1,000 words over time, this is high, but I think that in accepting a nomination, it's natural for any candidate to want to lay out a lot of goals and achievement and so on. So it's around 0.5. It goes way up in 2011, but now pretty much back down in his 2012 speech. So you could kind of chart this as a running index of potential frustration. Now, you may have been saying, well, this is all very well, but presidents don't write their own speeches. Are we getting the motives of the president or of the president's speechwriters? Obama speaks, but John Favreau, among others, writes. And here he is working with Obama on the State of the Union message. But all presidents have their speechwriters. My answer to this, well, I have 3 answers. Number one, speechwriters adapt to their client. They are picked by the president, by a political leader, by the candidate, for their ability to say what the president wants to say in words and images that feel comfortable for the president, especially for something as important as an inaugural address. The client, the president, reviews drafts and may actually make changes. In the Kennedy Library in Boston, you can see a late draft of Kennedy's inaugural, Sorensen's words, but with Kennedy's handwriting inserting images, some of which are scorable for motives. And finally, I am willing to say that maybe these scores aren't the scores only of the president inside the president's head, so to speak, but they may be a kind of collective or group mentality, or the scores of the collectivity that we call the presidential administration, with the speechwriter as the guy who writes it down. So everything I've said about Obama's motives may well be phrased as the motives of that loose collectivity that we call the Obama administration, or the Nixon administration, or the Carter administration, et cetera, et cetera. In any case, the real test of these numbers is, do they predict anything? And if they don't, who cares? And if they do, is it really important whether it's the speechwriter or the president. Now, putting everything I've said together in two ways, motives are only one aspect of personality, and they interact with all other aspects of personality. So if you compare Obama and his predecessor, their motive profiles are actually kind of similar. Very high power. Affiliation, Bush is a little higher, but they're both above average, and they're both average or below average in achievement. But looking at other aspects of personality, their social contexts are very different. The differences are in pink, the similarities in white. In terms of ethnicity and culture, in terms of money and social class, both Ivy League educations, interestingly enough, different places they were reared. Their traits, both perhaps extroverted, Bush probably more than Obama. Obama, relatively more conscientious, and these are not just my biased political estimates. These are some judgments of psychologists who have carefully measured and also studied presidential traits. And difference in openness to experience. One liberal, one conservative, one charismatic speaker, one, I think it's fair to say, rather awkward personal verbal style, though maybe I'm misunderestimating him. And then Obama higher, but not a whole lot higher in integrative complexity. My point is that the motives by themselves are not the whole story. You've got to take the motives in interaction with social contexts, which furnish channels for the expression of motives, traits, which furnish other channels, and cognitive style. And so a complete account of the personality of a political leader needs to take all four kinds of elements into account. Finally, I want to use this fourfold conception of personality to make a little complicated the notion of Obama as a calm, placid person, his legendary calm. When the New York Times interviewed a bunch of psychologists about this and wrote an article about it, everybody wanted to talk about his calm temperament as partly genetic, because it is probably true that emotional stability has a genetic basis. What I want to suggest, though, is that legendary calm can come from every aspect of Obama's personality, and I'm now assuming he is a relatively calm person. For one thing, he's very intelligent, and intelligence can promote emotional stability because it can lead you to be successful in understanding threats rather than just freaking out. Obama is capable of complex thinking. Same thing. Understanding rather than freaking. Obama has high power motivation, which is the appropriate motive, I think, for politics or for political success. He's not trying to fit himself a square peg into a round hole, so to speak, which can be a very stressful kind of thing. And finally, the sources of social context, of calmness in social context. Obama spent his entire life before college in two cultures that are known for being relatively laid back, Hawaii and Indonesia. He had loving grandparents who gave him, according to all accounts, the unconditional positive regard that someone like Carl Rogers says is essential for developing a kind of calm, mature adult personality. Well, Obama had that. He's also a black man who wants to succeed in the white world. And boy, if you are a black man wanting to succeed in the white world, you better appear calm even if you aren't calm. He had the example, the negative example of his father, who was hostile and aggressive back in Kenya toward Jomo Kenyatta. And as a result, never really got anywhere in the Kenyan government system. And Obama once said that every man is either trying to make up for his father's mistakes or live up to his expectations. Well, I think his father made a mistake. And I think Obama may have that example very much in the front of his consciousness. And then finally, of course, if you want to do well at Harvard Law School, it helps to be calm. And maybe it makes you relatively calm. So this fourfold conception is a way of taking a theme, calmness, and exploring how all four of these elements of personality can contribute to that theme or aspect of personality. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, well, so what about Willard Mitt Romney? We don't have an inaugural address to score. Perhaps someday there will be that. But what I have done on Romney is to look at his speeches announcing his candidacy in 2008 and in 2012. Actually, of course, it was given back in 2011, but it's for the 2012 election. Comparing them to Obama's 2008 announcement speech. Not sure what to think of these other than Romney's a lot lower in power this year than he was 4 years ago, about the same in achievement and lower in affiliation. Another way to talk about that is to calculate the vulnerability to frustration index, and Romney actually is quite high this year because his power has dropped but his achievement has stayed about the same. One might predict if this is a real enduring aspect of Romney's motivation rather than just a momentary snapshot, and I'm not sure it's anything other than a momentary snapshot, one might say, well, it is certainly true that Romney has shown many of the characteristics of an achievement-motivated person, varying his message and his behavior on the basis of results to suit the current context. I hope that's a polite way of putting it. Using feedback to change. One might say, well, if that's true, then perhaps as president, Romney is going to be very vulnerable to the kind of frustration that tormented Jimmy Carter, Lyndon Johnson, Woodrow Wilson. I make no predictions, but I thought you would probably want at least to have me mention the other candidate. And with that, I will conclude and thank you for your attention, and I will welcome your questions if you can stay on to discuss.
Questions?
Yes?
I'm wondering how much you guys involved kinesiology in this study.
How much what?
You like body, like the president's body language.
Yeah. Well, the question is, what about the president's body language? More broadly, can I say nonverbal behavior, which yeah, there are political psychologists who study that. I don't particularly. I think it's important, but you can only study a certain number of things. But yes, that is definitely one of the themes in political psychology, the nonverbal behavior of presidents, of people in political situations, so on and so forth. I focus on words, but words are not everything. Yes?
What was, as far as like power achievement, what was Clinton rated? I didn't get that.
Well, Clinton is kind of interesting because his inaugural address, he was very high in achievement. That was his major high motive. And the first couple of years were quite consistent with that. For example, his attempt at healthcare reform. He went about it in a classic achievement-motivated way. He picked a bunch of experts, locked them in a room, and said, come up with a healthcare reform proposal. And they did. It was, what, 1,200 pages long? He did not pay any attention to getting this through Congress. He did not even put Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democrats' go-to guy for health care, on the panel that was formulating this best of all health care proposals, with the result that it was dead on arrival in Congress. Clinton put his energy into the best proposal and no energy into the politics of getting it through Congress. And it flopped. Obama, with the opposite, that is power high, achievement low, what did he do? He more or less went to Congress and said, these are general guidelines. You guys work it out. And Congress, having constructed it, had bought into it. So I think that is an example of the difference in achievement-motivated versus power-motivated approach to solving a problem. Now, this is quite independent of whether, the actual content of the proposals, but it's how you formulate and then how you implement. Now, the interesting thing about Clinton is that he too got shellacked in the 1994 midterm election, and he changed dramatically. He changed a lot of his staff, and for fun, I took his State of the Union message every year. And what happened after 94 is achievement tended to go down, power tended to go up. And so the rest of Clinton's presidency was much more like that of a power-motivated president. He got reelected in a landslide, and then some of the less attractive characteristics of power motivation. He bombed, Belgrade in the Bosnian War, and the Sudan when he was trying to get Osama bin Laden. And of course, then there's Monica Lewinsky, speaking of sexual exploitation as an aspect of power motivation. So Clinton actually changed, and I think made a very interesting study of the going from achievement to power. Yes?
What value, if any, from a psychological standpoint, that when we vote, do we unconsciously vote our personhood, who we are? I am an achiever, a power-motivated person. I'm very passionate.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we utilize that when we vote versus an intellectual knowledge of this president? Because I would find myself jumping on the bandwagon of a president who is power-motivated,
Yeah.
who is passionate, without even thinking about, okay, let me look at all the details of what he's bringing to the table for his president.
Okay, the question is what might be called rational deliberation on the basis of policy stances versus a sense of emotional feel of the president. Well, I think both are important. I think that if you let's talk about the past. In 1968, you might have been high in power motivation, as was George Wallace, one of the candidates. But at least for me, Wallace's position was so repugnant on so many issues that he was not an option. And so even if, obviously I'm a Democrat, even if Hubert Humphrey may not have fit my motivational style, I was going to vote for Humphrey and not Wallace. Yes, because everybody's trying to occupy the center of explicit policy positions. And so the cognitions that you get are not of very much use. Yeah, I mean, here's how I would like to think that it works, and maybe someday I'll be able to think of an experiment or a study that will prove this, or maybe some of you will. Imagine that three-dimensional motivational space, and now put yourself in it, assuming we have a measure of your motives, and to the extent that you are closer to one of the candidates, you will probably have that sense of emotional or motivational resonance. They're talking your language, but at the kind of thematic level, not the explicit denotative level. So yeah, I think that's how this works. That unconscious or implicit pull that you feel is a function of how close your point in this three-dimensional space is to the candidates. And then there are other levels as well. That's assuming a basic, they're okay in terms of explicit policy positions, so that you wouldn't have in 1968 supported Wallace even if he was closest to your motive profile. Voting is, in that sense, multidimensional. And then there are other issues too. We probably tend to vote the way our friends vote, or at least we are affected by our friends. If all of my friends, well, I don't think it would change my presidential vote, but maybe my vote for representative or senator or city council or something like that. Complicated process, but I do think motivational congruence is one aspect. Yes?
I noticed there was a trend from Bush, Clinton, Bush to
Yeah.
with the power motives going up and
Mhm.
up and up. Is it possible that part of that, at least part of that, is a reflection of Americans kind of being told what they want to hear, like they're bouncing stuff off focus groups and they're sort of writing the inauguration speech to be more palatable to the American public? In other words, is there a correlation?
Well, okay, the question is, given the trend of motives scores in those 4 presidents with power constantly going up, you're imagining alternative interpretations. One interpretation would be that we're just getting more and more power-motivated presidents. Another interpretation is that American society seems to be calling for more and more power-motivated presidents. And so, hey, these candidates, they could be anything, but they're responding to a market as they perceive it, and so they're putting more and more of that imagery into their speeches. So is the president an independent actor, or is the president a reflection of the society that elects that president, or at least what he thinks that society is? And I'll answer with one word: both. Or I don't know, or it's probably a little of each.
That's what I suspected. I don't want to set up a false dichotomy.
Sure, sure.
It's probably
Yeah.
We have time for
We may be demanding this of our presidents.
we have time for one more question. There was a hand in the back there, and then
Yes, ma'am.
I want to know where you got your statistics on whose opinion, and does the political agenda of these statistics have anything to do with the study or the statistics?
Okay, you want to know where I got my statistics on what?
Where you got your statistics and on whose opinion, okay?
Sure.
And does the political affiliation of the statistics, or those that made the statistics,
Uh-huh.
have anything to do with the basis for the study?
Sure. Well, I think you mean the statistics of those various presidential outcomes, like rated greatness and great decisions
Yes.
and so forth, and scandals and so forth. Yeah.
Because they seem very political to me.
Yeah.
As an older person over in the classroom. So I want to have what your answer on.
Sure. Okay. Different sources for different statistics. I won't go back and put that table on the board, but we could talk about it afterward. Rated greatness comes from these studies of historians. Historians of American history or the American presidency are getting polled every now and then. As I said, there's a kind of cottage industry of that. And I simply took the numbers. Are these historians themselves biased, or do they have a particular orientation? Almost certainly. For one thing, we know they tend to like the war presidents. Probably they are more Democratic than Republican. I took the numbers that the studies produced. Assassination attempts, that's a pretty easy thing to measure. Actually, it gets complicated. You can talk about the presidents who were assassinated. You can talk about assassination attempts like Gerald Ford, but he never gave an inaugural, so we don't know. But somebody shot a gun in his presence. What about Richard Nixon? There was a weird guy named Samuel Bike who, with a pistol, tried to hijack a DC-9 airliner in the Baltimore airport and actually shot the pilot before he was himself shot. Stuff that he left in his car suggested he was going to try and get that airliner to crash into the White House to kill Nixon. But do you count that as an assassination attempt? It didn't get very far. And then if you account any old threat, the Secret Service will tell you that there are hundreds, thousands. So it's a little tricky to define operationally what you mean. Sex scandals, that was easy. Around the time of Clinton Lewinsky, the New York Times ran an article dredging up all the rumored sex scandals of all the presidents in American history, and I just took, were they mentioned in that New York Times article or not?
The three bases
Yeah.
affiliation and
Achievement. Yeah.
achievement, yes.
Yeah.
So you yourself got those statistics, or you got those from someplace, and they are very politically agenda.
Okay. Yeah. The motive scores themselves are based on the application of content analysis categories, scoring definitions, if you will. These kinds of images count for achievement or affiliation or power. And those categories, those definitions come from decades of experimental psychological research in the laboratory where, for example, this half of the room, we somehow arouse your achievement motivation or your power motivation. This half of the room, we have you doing some neutral thing. And then we give you all thematic apperception tests where you write stories to a series of pictures. And then we look at the differences to construct a category that we will call achievement or affiliation or power, depending on what we arouse. And then we do several different kinds of arousal experiments to make sure we're really measuring whatever. Those categories can be applied quite objectively with about 90% agreement, different scorers working independently. They aren't quite the sort of thing you can get a computer to do. What I did with the inaugural addresses is to have scorers score them using these categories. Different scorers agreed 90%. I took those scorings. So I would argue that the definitions that were applied were pretty objective because they were based on the experimental results. Now, it is true that when you're scoring a presidential inaugural address, when you come across the sentence, ask not what your country can do for you, et cetera, you know where that comes from. You know you're not just scoring whatever. You know it's not Calvin Coolidge. So there is the possibility that the scoring is going to be affected by the knowledge of what you're scoring, and so the scorers were not completely blind in the way that we like to do in psychological research, where the scorer doesn't know what is being measured. So I would say that both on the independent variable side, if you will, the motive scores, and on the dependent variable side, the presidential outcomes, there is probably some noise and possibly some bias, but there is a core of objectivity to both kinds of variables. And one can replicate, one can look for other people scoring the same data, other measures of presidential performance. I'd love to incorporate anything that anybody has ever measured with any kind of objectivity about the presidency.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Please thank Dr. Winter.
That is his approach. Yeah. His approach analyzes figures in US or in other countries and adapted in Indonesia. I don't know if we can manage not just political leaders like the presidents of Indonesia, but also other figures, something like I don't know, religious figures and the other, or Ustadz atau ya ketua MUI, ketua NU, ketua Muhammadiyah, kita lihat ya karakteristiknya gimana. Lalu, and it is interesting if we know the score of not just Jokowi.